Devastation Evokers have struggled for all of Dragonflight, and it looks like they aren't getting any better heading into the War Within, but Augmentation is going to get even more group buffs. Hi, it's Llarold, and I'm going to cover the new Scalecommander Hero Spec for Augmentation and Devastation Evokers. But before I do, I wanted to mention that we finally added memberships to our channel. We've been asked several times how viewers could show their support for the channel, and this is the answer to that. There are 3 tiers and the perks are pretty bare, but we'll likely expand on them in the future. So if you want to show your support, consider a membership. Alright, let me just drop my bona fides here. I've been playing WoW since 2005. I couldn't get it when it first came out. I didn't have a computer that could run it, which is embarrassing to think back to playing on an integrated graphics laptop, but I did finally get a computer that could run the game, barely. And from vanilla until Cataclysm, I played tons and tons of specs, spanning tens of thousands of hours. I played everything from Prot Warrior to Combat Rogue to Resto Shaman to Arcane Mage to Feral Druid. I ran dungeons and did raids as most of the specs in the game. In Mists of Pandaria, I started making Brewmaster Monk guides and quickly expanded to all tanks and Warlords of Draenor, and I've never really looked back. I haven't spent much time doing any kind of guide creation for DPS specs since then, but I have played DPS specs a lot. And I can honestly say this, Devastation Evoker is one of my favorite DPS specs in the game. It's simple, but it has a really fun gameplay loop. And I think it is a great beginner spec. It's just a shame that it sucks so much. And unfortunately, I do not think that this talent tree fixes that in the slightest, which is a real bummer. I want Devastation to be good. I spent a lot of time in Dragonflight Season 1 and 2 playing Devastation Evoker, and I really enjoyed it despite the awful 25-yard range limitation, and I spent a lot of that time hoping and praying that Blizzard would add a tank spec. Then they added Augmentation Evoker, and they basically ruined the game for everyone. I mean, not me. I actually like playing Augmentation Evoker, and I like having them in the group. I think the concept is super fun, but the damage contribution they bring is one of the worst in the game. It's like a reverse Discipline Priest. Disc Priest keeps people alive by dealing damage. Great concept, totally useful as a healer. Aug Evoker does not do much damage or healing, but it helps the group stay alive so that they can handle bigger, more dangerous pulls or live through overtuned raid mechanics. The problem here is that it's basically just a bad DPS spec outside of those specific situations. It's a utility spec. This makes it valuable for very specific high-level Mythic Plus pushing and raiding situations where group defenses and cooldowns that the spec provides are more valuable than the DPS that a better spec could offer. It's also pretty much the weakest choice available everywhere else. Alright, with all that preamble being said, let's take a look at this talent tree. Here we have the Scalecommander, Augmentation and Devastation Evoker Hero Spec tree. Now the top talent of the tree is, I think, pretty good. For Augmentation, it makes it so that your Empower spells cause your next eruption to strike up to 3 targets, and then it has this really nice line in here. It's kind of a design I'd like to see expanded to a lot of other things. When striking fewer than 3 targets, the damage of eruption is increased by 25% for each missing target. So if we just take a look here in game, eruption is your basic essence spender. It's really the only one you have as Augmentation, and it just sort of does a very small amount of damage. And it splits that damage between your enemy and the nearby enemies, so presumably this would triple that damage. It would cause that same effect to happen to 3 different enemies. Now the main real use of using Eruption is that it increases the duration of your active Ebb and Might, and it reduces the cooldown of Upheaval. Presumably, I think it's realistic to assume that that effect is not going to get tripled. That would be crazy. I think that basically it just means you're going to get triple the damage on a spell that really doesn't do a lot of damage in the first place. So that is a bit disappointing. Now, if we look at the devastation effect by comparison, Empower spells cause your next Disintegrate to strike up to 3 targets. Same deal. It'll do up to 50% more damage if it's in single target. This is actually, I think, mechanically a lot better and pretty good. One of the big issues that Devastation has had, one of many issues that they've had throughout this expansion, is that they basically have to alternate between using blue and red spells. Blue spells, your Eternity Surge, your Shattering Star, your Disintegrate, most specifically, are more single target oriented or maybe 2 or 3 target cleave. Your fire spells is much more AoE oriented. Pyre, Fire Breath, these are just full scale AoEs. And the problem with it is that you kind of want to get into a rhythm of using some red spells, alternating to some blue spells, back to some red spells, back to blue. You're bouncing back and forth. And that's kind of an issue since you are you know, in AoE, you don't really want to be using single target spells, and single target, you don't really want to be using AoE spells, and you kind of have to do some sort of bouncing back and forth to make full use of all the bonuses that you have in your tree. You can just let things expire, waste them, but that's not good either. And I think this helps quite a bit with that by allowing some of your disintegrate, specifically the ones that you would want to cast after using your Eternity Surge that are buffed by Iridescence. You cast Eternity Surge. Your blue spells are now empowered. You can throw out a Shattering Star and a Disintegrate that now, instead of hitting a single target, it's doing 3 targets, and potentially maybe that has an interaction with Scintillation where you have a 15% chance each time it deals damage. I mean, that makes sense, right? 3 different disintegrations all dealing damage. You have a chance for all of those to throw out Eternity Surges at nearby enemies. That could actually add up to a lot of AoE burst damage. This is a really good talent. Unfortunately, that's kind of where the good stuff for Devastation, it starts to really slow down fast. Might of the Black Dragonflight. Your black spells deal 10% increased damage. Unfortunately, you only have 1 black spell as Devastation that deals damage. We're not looking at professions here. Deep Breath, that's it. It deals not a lot of damage on a 2-minute cooldown. Now, there is some respecking that you could do. You could drop these amazingly powerful talents, Power Swell and Iridescence, or maybe you could lose Scintillation, which is really quite nice as well, and Hoarded Power. The problem here is that these have really good synergy with the top talent. You could drop some of these to pick up Onyx Legacy, pick up Imminent Destruction, give yourself a shortened cooldown on Deep Breath, a lot more value out of getting Deep Breath. You could potentially drop some other talent somewhere else to pick up Lay Waste and really maximize the damage out of Deep Breath. But the problem is there's not really any other synergy with Deep Breath. It's really not very interesting. It's a 1-minute cooldown, which is quite a lot less available than these more sustained damage spells, your Empower spells and Disintegrate or Pyre, depending on whether you're in single target or AoE. It doesn't really work as well to just put all of your eggs into the Deep Breath basket. So if you're not doing that, and I don't think you should, this basically adds nothing for Devastation. Now for Aug, it adds 10% more eruption damage and upheaval damage, and that's fine, but that is such a small amount of total damage. Maybe this is 7% more total damage as Aug, but 7% of a very small number is still, unfortunately, a pretty small number. All right, now we have Bombardments. This tacks a damage proc onto your Mass Disintegrate or your Mass Eruption. This just adds basically more fuel onto the fire, which is okay. It is a guaranteed mark on your primary target when you hit them with that Empowered Eruption or Disintegrate, and then that debuff gives you and your allies a chance, and we don't know what the chance is. If it's high, and if the tuning on the Bombardment proc that is a chance to proc here, if the tuning on that is high, it could be good. But the problem is, this seems like it is on the primary target, right? So it's not going on all 3 targets that you're getting your Disintegrate or your Eruption into. It's just going on the primary one. And then it is doing split damage among all nearby enemies. So even if the tuning is kind of high, that damage is still split. So it's not really going to scale very well into AoE. That's not great, and it's kind of a confused design here. You have this thing that is scaling well into AoE, but still has some actual value in single target, which is great. And then you have this mechanic right below it that is just immediately splitting in AoE situations. Not that good. Onslaught gives you a charge of Burnout, makes your next Living Flame cast instantly. Burnout is pretty nice. It is really quite convenient to have, but Living Flame doesn't do a ton of damage. I mean, it looks great. Like, let's stop and take a look at the cast animation. Beautiful. We absolutely love the way that Living Flame looks. I'm gonna throw it at some, can't throw that at NPCs. Throw that at a player here. I have to get so close to throw spells around. Yeah, looks awesome. Does it do a lot of damage? Not really. Melt Armor. Deep Breath and Breath of Eons cause enemies to take 20% increased damage from bombardments and essence abilities for 12 seconds. So once again, we have a talent here that seems to be incentivized specking out of these really good nodes over here that synergize with the top talent and into a more Deep Breath oriented setup. You're potentially going to be moving over to like a 1-minute Deep Breath and getting this extra value out of Imminent Destruction, getting more Deep Breath, more Pyre casts, generally speaking, in an AoE situation. You Deep Breath, now your Pyre only casts 1 essence, so you are spamming the hell out of Pyre. That sounds fun and cool. I guess, and you do get a big, like a 1 minute window where you have 12 seconds of burst damage. Okay, that's kind of cool. Now we move on to the part of the tree that really could make or break this, because I could be wrong. This could actually wind up being amazing, but I have significant doubts. Wing Leader makes it so that bombardments reduce the cooldown of Deep Breath and Breath of Eons by 1 second for each target struck up to 3 seconds. This is a talent right here. The tuning, specifically the proc chance, it doesn't even really matter so much how much damage bombardment deals itself. What the proc chance is will completely determine whether this tree works. If we do a little bit of napkin math and we just think a little bit about how often we use empower spells, the base cooldown on them as devastation is 30 seconds. Fire Breath and Eternity Surge both have base 30-second cooldowns. So that means you would be using, on average, 1 every 15 seconds. Now you are able to shave 10% of that cooldown off of Eternity Surge by running Event Horizon. You're also able to shave a lot more cooldown off of both of those by using Causality and making good use of it, either by throwing Pyre into AoEs, which you'll definitely be able to do with Imminent Destruction, and by hitting multiple targets, I suppose, with Disintegrate, or even just single target Disintegrates. I mean, both of those wind up adding presumably a lot of cooldown reduction. But if this is adding 3 ticks of that Causality damage reduction with each tick of Disintegrate, since it's hitting 3 targets, that could actually be quite substantial. This is pretty good, and it means that you could, I think, realistically shave at least 1/3 of the cooldown off, so we're talking every 10 seconds on average you'd be using an Empower spell. It might even be better than that. It might shave more like half of the cooldown off, which would be pretty amazing. That means you can have Bombardment up potentially 50% of the time or more, maybe even more like 75% of the time, which would be pretty strong. The issue here is, what is the chance on Bombardment to proc? If you have 100% uptime on it and the proc chance is still like 2 procs per minute, it's a proc per minute setup, that's not really going to fix anything. If it is just a flat chance and you are in a raid with tons and tons and thousands of hits per minute, then this could wind up adding massive, massive amounts of cooldown reduction. But if the proc chance is just a real procs per minute design and you're just getting like 3 to 5 procs per minute, that really doesn't wind up being a lot of cooldown reduction. Maybe 10, 15 seconds of cooldown reduction on Deep Breath. It's better than nothing, but if we're talking about redesigning your whole talent tree, revamping your whole talent tree, giving up these really powerful talents like Iridescence or, I mean, Arcane Vigor, another really great talent, to pick up things like Imminent Destruction and Onyx Legacy and build everything around using Deep Breath, potentially taking Lay Waste as well. If you're doing all of that and it's for a 48-second cooldown Deep Breath, that doesn't feel great. Now, just like with Devastation, the amount of cooldown reduction that you're going to get on Breath of Eons as Augmentation is kind of a black box. We just don't know what the proc rate of Bombardment is, and that really is the thing that's going to be crucial for all of this. The idea that you could get potentially 20 or 30 seconds taken off of the average cooldown of Breath of Eons is interesting. You could bring it down from the base cooldown is 2 minutes. You're able to shave 10% of that off, so 12 seconds with interwoven threads by default. That's pretty good, and being able to shave, you know, maybe another 20 seconds off of Breath of Eons can be okay, but it needs to line up with other players in your group's cooldowns. It needs to line up with pulls at the right times. There are plenty of situations in Mythic Plus where if you're near the end of a pull or you're doing a very small pull where hitting a Breath of Eons on everything and things might die before the Breath of Eons is expired, or the pull's just not very dangerous and you want to hold it, that cooldown reduction might actually wind up being totally wasteful. So I'm not against the idea of cooldown reduction. I always like cooldown reduction. It is the most fun mechanic. The problem here is that this is very yes or no. Either this lines up perfectly and makes things work that otherwise wouldn't have, or it kinda doesn't do a lot at all. Unrelenting Siege makes it so that for each second you're in combat, Azure Strike and Living Flame deal 1% increased damage up to 50%. Now, this doesn't seem like it resets. It seems like if you're in combat for 50 seconds, Living Flame's terrible damage output goes up by 50%, and I do think that's good. Again, still looks great. Love to look at it. Love to throw it around if I'm allowed to. Yeah, I love throwing Living Flames around. Now, Azure Strike, It does so little damage. It's really, really terrible. 50% more damage on no damage is still no damage. Something you can hit while you're moving, I guess, when you don't have a hover available, but still quite bad. Hardened Scales makes it so that Obsidian Scales reduces damage taken by an additional 5%. That's, I think, pretty conservative. It's a 30% damage reduction cooldown. It should probably be at least 10% to me. I would rather see it do something like increase the duration or maybe reduce the cooldown. I think that would be a lot more appealing, but I'm not going to say no to more damage reduction. I think that's still okay. Menacing Presence makes it so that knocking an enemy up or backward reduces their damage done to you by 15% for 8 seconds. This could be really useful in PvP, hitting people with a wing buffet and then getting basically a mini defensive cooldown. I think that's pretty good. One thing I noticed here is that it doesn't say using tail swipe or wing buffet. It does say knocking them back or up. So if there are any new engineering tools that allow you to knock enemies around, up, back, whatever, other things that can knock enemies up, upheaval, as augmentation knocks enemies up. So this could actually have pretty high uptime for augmentation and actually be a pretty good source of damage reduction on, unfortunately, a spec that is already extremely tanky. But, you know, it's, I mean, I'm not going to say no to more defensive cooldown, more defensive value, and it's not a bad thing to get, even if it's not really all that important. Moving on to the next choice node of Extended Battle and Diverted Power, we once again have a chance here, a chance of bombardments generating Essence Burst. This is a chance on top of a chance. We don't know how good the chance of bombardments is, and now we don't know what the chance of them generating Essence Burst is. So this one seems like a real gamble to me. By comparison, Essence abilities extending bombardments, Essence abilities being either Eruption as augmentation or Disintegrate and Pyre as devastation. I think for my mind, my thinking, making use of Wing Leader and Melt Armor and everything that you can to make your Deep Breath more available and really lean into the theme of this whole tree, I think Extended Battle makes a lot more sense, and I think it seems like a lot better talent here. Finally, we have a utility option. Nimble Flyer makes it so that while you're hovering, damage from area of effect attacks is reduced by 10%. Now, this seems very, like, weirdly specific. It is thematically consistent. If I just tap Zephyr here, you do get a very weak move speed increase for you and your group. And more importantly, you get, I believe it's 20%. Yep, 20% AoE damage reduction. That's pretty good. And you know, the thing is that area of effect damage is a lot of the damage that you take in a lot of situations. Any sort of random pulsing boss damage, stuff that you can't avoid, but also tons of the stuff that you can avoid is AoE damage. Think about circles on the ground that you have to move out of. So getting some damage reduction on that, specifically while you're hovering, usually while you're trying to move quickly to get out of them, that is actually pretty useful. By comparison, Tailwinds just gives you a cooldown reset on hover when you use Deep Breath or Breath of Eons. That's pretty convenient as well. Being able to move and cast at the same time is sort of the gamble that you have to make in playing this class at all, and accepting the fact that you have this horrendously limiting 25-yard range on all your spells. So having more access to hover is always a good thing, and it's always something I like to have. You know, I wish it didn't come with the incredibly constraining limitation of having that, I mean, literally less range than a Frost DK or a Ret Paladin. This tree ends with maneuverability. Deep Breath and Breath of Eons can now be steered in your desired direction. I can't imagine that you're going to have that much control over it, but maybe a little bit. Maybe, like, I would imagine probably a level similar to keyboard turning. So, you know, not great. I'm having to use my arrow keys to do this. Not a massive amount of control. I would even think probably maybe a little bit less than keyboard turning. So like instead of just walking straight down the road, you could slightly angle a little bit. Is that all that great? You know, it probably should be built into the talents by default. Deep Breath and Breath of Eons, you probably should just be able to move while you're doing them by default. In addition, it also burns targets for some amount of volcanic damage over 12 seconds. Now, I do think that could be good for Devastation, especially with all the cooldown reduction that you're getting, the full minute out of Onyx Legacy, and then all of the cooldown reduction that you're getting out of Wing Leader, especially if that damage is able to be buffed by Lay Waste, which is possible. 20% more damage on top of this damage, and then if you're getting Deep Breath into a 30-second range, you're getting like close to 50% uptime on this dot. That might actually be useful in some AoE situations. Maybe. The problem I have with this tree is that it seems like whoever made it tried to kludge two ideas into each other. I think that this top talent idea, Mass Eruption, Mass Disintegrate, and the bombardments, I think they make sense and they actually work pretty well. I think they could be a really cool concept if they had leaned more into that and not done anything with Deep Breath and Breath of Eons. I think this would actually be a pretty appealing tree, and it might make people say like, oh, they fixed it. It's good now. It could be good. It's not impossible, right? There's always, you know, they could just go, oh, the damage on Evoker is actually really, really terrible and has been forever. We're going to buff it by 30%. And now they're great, right? 30% would be enough to put them at the top of the charts. It's not impossible for this to work. It's not impossible for this to be good. And if it actually does come together and the bombardments are a really common proc and you get massive amounts of cooldown reduction and you're deep breathing all over the place and you have tons of control over it and it's dealing tons of damage and it's giving you this ability through imminent destruction to just spam pyre like crazy in AoE, I actually think this could be fun. It just would take a lot on Blizzard's part. They would really have to do a lot between now and this being in the game for this to actually work and be good. For Augmentation, I kind of see a bit more appeal. The problem here is that this Wing Leader, the cooldown reduction on Breath of Eons, that really doesn't do as much for me for Augmentation because it is so pass-fail as to whether you actually want to use those cooldown reduced Breath of Eons as soon as they come up or not. But the amount of damage that you could add through bombardment, especially if that's not like scaled down for Augmentation for some reason, that could actually wind up adding a lot of damage. And that really is the biggest issue that Augmentation has facing it. It is not capable of bringing a competitive amount of damage, which is the gamble that you make by bringing one. You bring it so that it can provide defensive value and allow the other classes that do more damage to shine, to reach their full potential. If Augmentation was then able to, like it was at the very start of Season 2, bring a highly competitive amount of damage due to these bombardments, maybe Augmentation Evoker could go back to the level of dominance that it experienced early on in its implementation towards the end of Season 2, which I don't really know that that would be good for the game, considering how much defensive utility the spec brings to groups. I think it might actually be a bad thing for Augmentation Evokers to also provide competitive damage output, but it is something that we'll have to keep a watchful eye on as we head into the next expansion, because it could totally change the meta. It could totally make the Augmentation Evoker not just something that's really useful at high end and then kind of a trap on the way up to that point, but actually useful at all levels. For Devastation, I would say cautiously optimistic is maybe the most positive spin I could put on it. I don't have super high hopes, primarily because I just don't think that building around Deep Breath really sounds all that fun or great. But I could be wrong. Maybe this could wind up being really good, especially if there is sort of underlying changes to the base class. I am hopeful that Blizzard does something about it because I want this class to be good. I want it to finally be a successful class, specifically as a DPS. I really do want that, and I think it's possible, but there are some significant changes that are going to need to be made along the way in order for that to finally come true. All right, that's it. Thanks for watching. Bye.